They laughed before the appetizer arrived. It was a soft, hollow sound, the kind that lives in the throat and slides out like water. At the head of the table, my son smiled with the practiced indulgence of someone who always imagined he held the world's patience in his palm. Beside him, his fiancée tapped her nails against the menu like she was keeping time with a small private metronome. I remember the restaurant's lights catching the silver of a wine glass, making it bloom white, and the polite murmur of other dinners folding over us like a curtain. I remember my hand on the table, the roughness of the wood where years of small repairs hid under varnish. I remember thinking for a single rational second about the bill. The waiter came with the menus, deferent and warm. Like everyone working tonight, was trying to make their corner of the world feel like a happier place than it really was. My son, Justin, glanced at his phone and announced a new project he was launching next month. He expects me to clap in the right spot. I nod. I know where my applause must fall. I kept my voice small. I always do when money is the subject that might be misread as an invitation to pity. I ordered simply soup the fish special water. It is an old habit to order modestly in public, once because modesty was necessary, now because it is part of the play he does not understand he is in. They traded looks, the kind of quick arithmetic children of convenience use to measure the man they call father. The fiancée raised an eyebrow I had seen on social feeds and in lifestyle shows. It is a small performance, perfected for guests and cameras and the people who count good breeding and clever investments more than blood. You should know something about me. I built things with my hands. I learned to find fault lines where others saw only comfortable surfaces. I worked before dawn when the city still switched off its porch lights. I fixed transmissions in a garage that smelled of grease and coffee. I drove to 3 jobs a day because bills arrived with a remarkable fidelity. I did not go to college. I did not need to. I had calluses and a ledger of favors everyone else called jokes. I married a woman who believed in my quiet competence. When my wife died, I kept the house because she left me the mortgage and an old box of letters, one of which said, "You keep living to the sound of small joys." I did not tell Justin how I had built the business. He chose to believe the story that suited him, that his father had always been frugal. He did not ask about the rows of small restaurants that bore my surname in the legal papers he never read. He saw me as a simple man who ordered plain fish. When the waiter set a plate in front of me, the steam rose in a small fog between us, and the meetings of their eyes tightened like hands closing. Later, when the check came, something that had been folded into the corner of the evening unfolded at my feet. Justin and his fiancée leaned forward, outraged on principle, and I nodded like a man who had no right to be surprised. I reached for my wallet for an old habit, and the waiter put the bill in front of us with a small, careful flourish. He said my name. The sound of that single syllable on a printed receipt landed like a physical thing on the table. It was my legal name, the one on tax forms and deeds, the one that had co-signed 100 leases and stamped 1,000 invoices. My name. They stared at it. Their faces changed so fast, I felt a wordless shiver in the ribs where memory lived. For a moment there was silence, private and loud. Then the laughter. The sound made like someone flipping a switch. You do not start a story with the truth and expect it to remain tidy. I started this with the moment I had waited to see for years, the man who had never known my measure, choosing mockery over curiosity. Tonight that measure was the bill in front of them. Tonight my name was on the check, not as a signature but as a revelation. If you want to trust a man, learn this. There is a difference between being poor and choosing to appear poor. I had been both at different times. Tonight I was an actor playing a part I used to be, to watch the people I loved make themselves visible. We were at a place that smelled faintly of lemon and melted butter, designed to make children of comfort comfortable. It was the flagship of a small chain that had started in a single room with a stove that never cooled. The irony lodged like a grain of glass in my gut. When the waiter said my name, Justin asked, loud enough for near tables, "Are you paying the bill?" His voice had that soft challenge that men use when they are taught to expect things their fathers did not give them. I smiled like a man in a photograph. The betrayal did not arrive as a blow. It arrived as a small domestic cruelty. Justin stood and walked out. He said nothing to me as he left. He took his coat and his fiancée left hers behind, an angry ghost. The couple walked away from the table like vultures, deciding the carrion was no longer worth the fight. They paced down the hallway and out into a night that smelled of rain. They did not mind that someone might be sitting there in their father's stead. They did not mind that people watched. They did not mind that in their leave-taking, they had made an audience of strangers and a spectacle of family. I sat alone with the bill and my name printed on the top. The waiter, a young man with the patient face of someone who dreams of a life different from the one he has, stood at the edge of the hour and asked if I was all right. I told him yes, because lying to servers has always been easier than explaining the arithmetic of family. That was the end of the opening, the moment I had kept in the safe of my chest. But the whole story lived in the days before that laugh, in the small things that lead people to think themselves clever. I will tell you now, because a story like this must be paid back to memory. For 25 years I worked the same city blocks. I opened a sandwich joint with a borrowed stove and two good friends who could hold a conversation about engines and salt at the same time. We turned the place into a small miracle by putting honest food on plates people would come back for. We learned to read the crowd. Night shift nurses, exhausted parents, men in suits who misfiled their lives. We learned to pour dignity in the shape of bread and gravy. We learned that people will keep a secret if you cook it well and wrap it in kindness. From there we expanded, one tiny property at a time, each kitchen a temple of routines. My hands stayed in the work. I wrote checks and signed leases and fixed sinks and argued with suppliers. I was not a man who ever needed to proclaim a fortune, because the kind of wealth I had is measured in receipts and employees who keep the work honest. My name is on paper because I signed the papers when I had to, not because I wanted my son to know. I thought he would inherit a sense. I thought he would learn gratitude by watching me give things away. I miscalculated the appetite of a boy raised on photos. There are small betrayals that grow like mold if you do not see them. When my wife died, the shop became my anchor. Justin moved away and called on the weekends that suited him. He married the right woman the way my generation learned to call a good mechanic, when something was broken and needed fixing fast. He spoke of a life where things came pre-assembled and decisions had boxed instructions. He never learned the slow motion of building. So that night, when they laughed and walked away, I slid back into the chair like a man who had been waiting to measure the room. I folded my hands. The cutlery chimed like tiny bells. I watched the back of Justin's head disappear through the door, and then I watched the waiter, whose eyes had been kind, set the check with my name down and move away. I stared at the print, as if it might rearrange itself into a different truth. It did not. I pocketed the receipt inside my coat like a rectangular evidence, and walked out into a night that smelled faintly of the same rain that had been falling the day my wife died. That night, I went home, and once inside the quiet of my kitchen, I did what I always do when I think of justice. I cleaned a plate, sharpened a knife, and took inventory of what I had and what I could afford to lose. The seed for everything that came later was not malice. It was a geometry problem, angles and leverage. It was a plan for equilibrium that a man without illusions might follow. Humiliation is not a single blow. It is a slow weathering. The night after Justin left his plate, he called. He left a message that wanted to be gentle and rehearsed and failed. "Hello, Dad," he said, with that economy of concern people use when they believe the world owes them time. I listened to it twice and then deleted it. I did not call back. People expect people like me to speak in a register that troubles them, in a voice that apologizes. I had always apologized for small things. I had never apologized for my own existence. Tonight, silence felt necessary. It was strategic. To tell you about the fallout, I must take you into rooms where the small things live. There is a smell in my garage that has become a kind of memory. It is oil, warm tools, the faint cleft of gasoline, and wet rags. I have always sat in that smell like a man in his uniform. When humiliation gnaws, the places you have loved respond as witnesses. They remember the repairs you made for others that no one noticed, the nights you slept 5 hours, because a kitchen leak had to be fixed before morning orders. That smell kept me from unraveling. It also kept me honest. Work is harder to perform than grief. Flashes came in the days after the dinner. A cashier who had slid me a coupon when my wife was in hospital. The sound of her voice when she said, "Mr. Ellis, you are doing too much." Justin at 13, shoulders bent beneath the weight of a baseball bag and a sorry grin. My wife laughing at a joke about overcooking pasta. The smell of that butter again. Memory is a room with many doors, and I opened each one. Not to be sentimental, but to inventory assets, not only physical assets, but soft ones. Who remembered me? Who owed me? Who might answer a favor? The first sting came in small social humiliations. People I had known for years began to talk around me. Neighbors who once asked about the garden now asked my son about the projects that came to him. Justin posted photos with a new car, a gloss of tinted windows, and that glazed look of people drunk on status. I read the comments and felt their warmth like static. They used words success, hard-working, inspiring like talismans. They had forgotten the hands that taught the boy to tie his shoes. It is an odd thing to be erased in layers, to be remembered only as a footnote in your child's brand narrative. I replayed the restaurant scene in detail, like an engineer reverse engineering a failure. Where had my timing allowed him to leave? What gestures signaled contempt? When he rose and left, he had not even looked back. That small omission hurt in a specific way. My blood pressure rose often in the week that followed. I kept a small thermometer in the fridge because I had once been a man who measured things precisely. I walked the restaurants late that week. I moved amongst my staff like a visiting general and listened. People feel free to speak differently when they think the boss is not really present. A young cook told me about a delivery man who had made a joke about the owner being stingy. The joke was not meant to be cruel, but I recorded it like an audio file and saved it. Another employee mentioned a local food columnist who had once praised our founder and then stopped returning calls. Small cracks appeared where I had once assumed seamless loyalty. And the smell of butter and lemon followed me into night. I dreamt of plating, of steam and condensation on metal, and of a check that was stamped in relief with my name. I dreamt of Justin's mouth turning into a purse snarl. Dreams became rehearsals for a performance I did not yet know how to stage. There is a peculiar winter to humiliation. You walk through the days convinced that other people can see your nakedness. You imagine the way they think of you, and the imaginings are often crueler than the facts. I called old friends and kept the conversations anchored in business, supply contracts, appliance repairs, the slow march of a new oven. When I asked about the lease on a small property 2 streets over, a friend on the phone stumbled with an answer. It was, he said, surprising how quickly things move. I noted the exact phrasing and replaced surprise with curiosity. A man training for revenge learns to treat emotion like inventory. The worst moments were the small ones at home. I would walk into a room and expect the face of a son who might acknowledge me and find only a photograph on a mantle I had polished. I would set down a mug and the sound of ceramic on wood would echo like a verdict. Occasionally a neighbor would knock and bring a pie, and the kindness would land with the awkwardness of a gift offered to a stranger. These were gestures that wanted to be both neighborly and performative. They taught me that people will give kindness in public and withdraw in private. Yet it was not all emptiness. There were surprising, patient loyalty pockets. Regulars at the shop left notes. "Thanks for Tuesday, loved the stew, call me if you need anything." An old delivery driver, whose son I had once helped with a scholarship, came by and said nothing at all but deposited a box of spare parts in the back and nodded like a man who felt debts in his bones. I learned to take these small human ledgers seriously. They were the hinge upon which the rest of my plan would swing. Humiliation hardens into resolve, not in the speeches that movies give you, but in the little acts of calibration. I measured dates. I catalogued who had laughed and who had merely observed. I photographed receipts, kept the restaurant check in a drawer under a stack of invoices. I made lists that began like this: who left, who laughed, who watched, who remained. These lists were not evidence of obsession. They were business planning. Then Justin sent a congratulatory message that read like a script for someone else. "Can't wait to celebrate tonight." "Proud of you, Dad." A semicolon of approval, so I read it and set it aside. My hands held steady. There is a quality to resolve that feels like a muscle, learning a new motion. deliberate, slow, inexorable. You do not always recognize the exact moment you decide to stop being pushed. For me, it was an afternoon in the warehouse, when the furnace clanged and a delivery truck backed into a stack of boxes. A young waitress I had trained stood there with flour on her apron and a way of looking at the wreckage that made me think of all the times I had cleaned up messes for others, without thanks. She looked at the ruined crates and then at me and said quietly, "It's okay, Mr. Ellis, we can fix this." The casual dignity of that statement settled like a physical thing in my chest. My threshold is not melodramatic. It is geometric. There is a shape to a life, and when others begin to draw new lines through it without permission, you find other lines. I remember that afternoon the smell of steam from the broken cans, the taste of coffee gone cold at my tongue, and I decided. I set down the wrench and walked outside. I sat on the loading dock and watched a skyline I had labored to serve. The decision arrived like a practiced calculation. Protect what is mine, expose who would take advantage of it, and above all, do this with arms that do not tremble. It helps to imagine revenge as machinery. Machines do not feel. They function. You design a contraption of consequences, a liver here, a careful misdirection there, a timed pressure where the other man thinks there is none. That day I began to map a machine. First thing, control the narrative spaces. We had restaurants across town, each with managers who trusted me because I had worked beside them. Trust is a currency, and it had to be converted into actions that could change perception. If Justin thought of me as small, I would make him confront the scale of what he underestimated without shame and without spectacle. The plan could not hinge on spectacle. Spectacle would give them a way out, a story of luck. I needed a mirror. Second thing, enlist allies who have little to lose. The world is full of people waiting for the right reason to take a stand. The waitress with flour was one. The dishwasher who switched shifts so a single mother could pick up her child was another. They were not foot soldiers. They were quiet custodians of a truth. We keep the world running. I needed their slow consent. I needed their ability to do things day in and day out without anyone watching. The kind of plan I would deploy requires people who take action like breathing. Third, information. I began to collect details that had once been inconsequential. The contacts for the leases, the exact clauses stipulating ownership of a venue, the small print where rights hide like worms in apples. In the quiet hours of my office, the fluorescent light humdrum and the smell of paperwork my companion, I read contracts like others read poems. I discovered that several venues used for events had subtle language that could be enforced if demand was made. I noted the phrase non-transferable usage and the clause about security deposits. I found out where Justin was insured and where his assets were nominal. Fourth, prepare a non-emotional face. When you move people with strategy rather than anger, you deprive them of performance. They want to turn the room into a courtroom of feelings, and if you refuse, they are disarmed. I began to train my voice to be small in public and clear in private. I practiced being unremarkable and then, in key places, utterly inevitable. And fifth, the moral argument. Revenge without a moral anchor becomes bloodlust. I wanted justice. I thought of fairness like an engineering principle, corrective action that restores balance. My plan would not injure ruinously. It would reveal. It would let the truth stand naked and let consequences follow. When the first small actions were taken, they were anonymous. A supplier was reminded of late fees that had been overlooked on a corporate account. A venue owner received a letter clarifying ownership and the right to satisfy obligations. Nothing dramatic, just a gentle, precise application of leverage that loosened threads. The threads did not unravel overnight, but as they began to tick, I could sense throttle points and responses. There was a setback. A manager misread an instruction and priced a private dinner incorrectly. Staff confusion almost exposed my involvement. I watched from my office as a young manager fumbled and lied. He lied because he was frightened. I sat with that, took notes, and when the moment required it, I replaced the manager. Replacements are not pleasant. They are necessary. The people who remain in your orbit during difficult operations are the ones who will carry the integrity of your plan forward, the single decisive idea that would carry us to the restaurant scene was deceptively simple. Create a moment where the world could see what the sun could no longer pretend to ignore. Our flagship hosted charity dinners and private bookings. These events are small ecosystems of credibility. If the wrong person is invited at the right time, stories can pivot. I told no one what I intended. Plans are fragile when known. I worked by memos labeled as mundane. I adjusted schedules and trained waitstaff in a manner that would make an evening feel organic. The right dish, recommended by a server who believed in it wholly. A sommelier who praised a wine I had a share in distributing. We rehearsed manners, not scripts. There is a subtle difference. Then I set the date for a private dinner for Justin and his soon-to-be bride. I sent the invitation under the pretense of a small family evening. It would be ordinary enough to be believable, and curated enough to deliver the consequence I had calculated. The breaking point is unromantic. It is a sequence of measured choices, neither cruel nor merciful but effective. When a man has been pushed into a corner not by force but by negligence, sometimes the most honest response is to show him a mirror and leave him to see his own reflection. Planning is a ledger of tiny certainties. I needed 3 certainties that could be controlled. First, presence. Justin must be there. People believe what they see with their own eyes more readily than what they are told. Second, timing. The moment and the reveal must align like a watch. Hinge, third, witnesses. The right audience turns revelation into public fact. Presence was secured by a mixture of familiarity and convenience. I called and asked Justin to dinner as a favor. I said nothing about place. People decline invitations for many reasons, but seldom do they decline because dinner smells of unknown consequence. I made sure the evening was scheduled on a night when he had no pressing commitments, and offered in passing to pick up his fiancée. He accepted. He always accepts when offered convenience. Timing depended on the bravado of the waitstaff. We rehearsed with top-down discipline. The hostess would greet without fanfare and seat them at a table near the kitchen, but not so near as to suggest staged attention. The waiter assigned to them had been with us for 8 years and had the particularly useful quality of being quietly precise. He had grown up in town and treated customers like neighbors, never too much and never too little. I instructed him to suggest the most modest plates at first. The bait must smell like truth. Witnesses were the tricky component. Too many witnesses dilute the intimacy of humiliation. Too few and the act stays private. The aim was to craft an audience of peers who would translate an intimate awkwardness into social currency. An evening at the flagship with a few tables nearby would do. We made sure some local business owners were seated close enough to overhear the incidental lines of conversation without feeling assaulted. I brought in one more, variable, a partnership with a local food writer who had once given the chain a flattering review and then drifted into larger publications, his praise diluted by distance and time. He was a man who loved seeing the fallen restored when the facts were right. I asked him to come that night under the pretense of a quiet meal. He obliged. He did not know the whole plan. He only needed to be present and adjacently observant. Logistics occupied my days. I adjusted reservations, recalibrated supply deliveries to ensure we had the special wine Justin loved at precisely the right moment. I confirmed the server would say my name when presenting the check. The server hesitated only once, wary of being drawn into family politics, and I told him in private that he would do as trained. He replied with a simple "I know." Some people understand professions as identities, not roles. The waiter knew I was asking for the truth. We simulated everything: lighting, the clink of silver, the rise of steam. In the back office, I sat with the manager and wrote an email that would be sent to the owner of a small event venue Justin liked for his future wedding. The email would clarify ownership and the right to enforce terms. The owner, an old man who had once talked shop with me over coffee, would receive that letter and know how to act if I called. Arrangements were made in layers, so no single action would look rehearsed. A machine functions best when no one is conscious of its gears. There were small victories, confirmations, polite agreements, a waiter who practiced the line of my name until it sounded like an ordinary part of the evening. There were setbacks too. A delivery was delayed, and one of the special dishes was late to the table. We adjusted. The subtlety of the plan is not found in tempo but in adaptation. When a machine encounters resistance, it flexes and completes its motion. As the night approached, I felt something I had not noticed in years, a cool clarity. Not pleasure, not malice, but the sharpness of a man who knows he must carry through what he began. Plans are judged not by their inception, but by their fidelity to the finish. I visited the staff the morning of and told them only this: be kind and be precise. Be kind because we are not monsters. Be precise because truth must not be clumsy. When Justin arrived that evening, he came in with the swagger of someone who believes he owns tomorrow. The fiancée was bright and anxious. They found their table and sat. The music was soft. I sat at a table across the room, under the pretense of being a quiet diner. I watched them through the little movements of their knives and watched the edges of his smile when he noticed someone paying attention to him. I felt nothing like triumph. I felt the documentation of a test that needed completing. The evening unfolded like a clock. The waiter brought the small plates, made the suggested recommendations, and then retired to the margins like a careful actor. Conversation flowed, the kind that builds with condensation and laughter. At a crucial moment, when the fiancé's hand grazed Justin's and he leaned forward to tell a story about an investor pitch, the waiter came with the dessert menu and then the final bill. He set it down, and with a deliberate calmness he said, "Mr. Ellis, your bill is on the house." When the name landed, the room shifted. You could feel the air tighten like linen on a suit. Justin looked up. His mouth made a small O. The fiancée colored. They were unprepared for my name like a physical fact in front of them. They had expected, I suppose, that my anonymity would persist. He reached out to pick it up and then hesitated. He did not know whether to look embarrassed on my behalf or outraged on his. Social confusion is a weak weapon. It will not hold up under precision. They stood and left again, but this time their exit had no swagger. They folded into themselves like someone whose clothes no longer fit. Justin spoke, muttering something about a misunderstanding, and the fiancé's shoulders made tiny, embarrassed gestures. People who witnessed the scene exchanged looks and then turned back to their meals. The world had been asked to witness a small, undeniable truth, and it obliged by watching without comment. The waiter moved quietly, a man who had been taught to hold the table with dignity. It was not yet the final moment. The machine required one more part, the conversation that would follow in public spaces. The food writer, who had been eating quietly, later wrote a column about the evening that did not shame but set a stage. He described a quiet man who ran several small eateries in town and who chose to sit at his table like any other patron. He noted the surprise of seeing the owner's name on a bill as a point of irony. Words like irony move in social currents and can shape reputations. This kind of justice is not a snap. It is a slow, gleaming thing you line up with patience and execute with principle. The next stage is execution proper. Execution is where the machine hums loudest. My aim was not to humiliate publicly for the sake of cruelty. It was to make a man who had normalized neglect see, by measure, the span of consequence. That night, Justin returned home and posted photos of the evening, as people do when their hearts need decoration. He captioned it, "Another great meal with Dad," in a tone that wanted to be conciliatory, but read like a challenge. Social media is an ecosystem of appearances and their enforcement. I had positioned myself to make a particular appearance impossible to sustain. The column the food writer produced amplified the event beyond the restaurant. It described the way diners had watched the receipt and the way the owner had been treated, and it asked questions about how easily people mistake a man's manner for poverty. The local paper picked it up and amplified the piece to a small feature. In the piece, someone quoted a server asking a simple question: "Do you always underestimate the people who pass the plates?" Justin saw the article. He called twice and left messages. He asked to meet the next morning at his office. He wanted to make the public argument of guilt into a private conversation of reconciliation. I agreed to meet. At the meeting, he came with a polite, practiced shame. He used words like sorry and thoughtless. He wanted briefly to sweep the past under a rug of contrition. We sat across from each other in a part of the city where glass faces the street and people look through the windows like spectators of minor tragedies. He spoke of stress and an investor and the pressure of the new venture. He said he had been embarrassed at dinner because of how the group had looked at him and that he had acted selfishly in leaving. He wanted the narrative repaired. I listened politely and then, in a voice that had been trained in offices and shop floors and quiet nights, I asked a single question. "Do you know what our leases say about the wedding venue you wanted to book?" He blinked. He had no idea. He assumed a man like me had little business interest in the affairs of a young couple. I told him I had received a letter that morning, clarifying ownership of the venue he wanted. It was a small legal detail that meant the owner could enforce Boolean rights if they were ignored. He fumbled for a retort about who pays for what at a wedding, and I let him. The first public reversal came when I called the owner of the venue and asked if the contract Justin had signed, and Justin had signed quickly, in the romance of an event planner, would be honored only if a deposit cleared. The owner, a practical man, said yes. I told him I would ensure that the conditions of the contract would be applied strictly. That evening, the wedding planner called Justin with a polite but unyielding list of requirements and a mention that the non-refundable deposit agreed to at signing had not been processed. The language used was cold, because it must be cold when payment realities meet live emotion. Justin panicked and called his bank and his investors. He called his fiancée and they argued. Behind the scenes, the chef and waiters I had placed in the right positions began to feed small, anonymous pieces of truth into the local conversation. A whisper here, a memory there. People begin to triangulate reputations from small details. Then came the legal notice that a venue owner friend of mine sent regarding the property initially discussed on Justin's wedding plan. The letter was short and exact. The space is maintained as a tenant property, and the use clause required explicit sign-off on a large removal of insurance in the case of wedding cancellations. In normal course, it is nothing. In context, it is a high-tension check that would require immediate action by Justin's team to show solvency. This is where the personal and the public meet. The pressure grew. Without theatrics, obligations sat upon them like a slow tax. They called in favors and discovered that favors are currency that must be regularly topped up. Some were not available. People ducked. Then, at the height of it, one small detail turned into a public turning point. A vendor who had been unreliable called Justin and said, "We cannot deliver because you are behind on payment." The message got into the social feeds. Friends started to talk. The wedding went from an image to an operational problem. Justin, whose image had been carefully polished, had to show the mechanics of his life and not the sheen. There is a moment when someone used to a performance is forced to show the backstage, and the difference is shattering. The confrontation happened with no shouting. He called me in the office again, raw. He said his pride had been wounded, his reputation endangered. He asked for help like a man who had never asked for much. I told him the truth. "You treated me like an invisible instrument. You left me at a table you believed not in the man who fed you, but in the story that fed you." I did not shout. I did not throw things. I sat with the arithmetic of his life where it was solvent and where it was air, and then I offered a ledger. I could have destroyed him. I had resources. The company could have enforced contracts that would take his assets in liquidation. Instead, I chose a different corrective action that taught but did not ruin. I wrote him a check for the deposit required to secure the venue, and I made the condition explicit. He would sign an agreement to involve me in the planning and to understand what obligations entail. He would learn, and he would carry that lesson like a price. He signed. The price was humility. The price was not a criminal ruin. Public exposure followed. The columnists wrote about the way we treat our elders and how we often confuse quietness for insignificance. The narrative shifted subtly from humiliation of a father to the accountability of a son. People began to say things out loud they had been thinking in private. Justin's investors called and asked for audited ledgers. He complied. He felt the narrowness of competence and the length of his gaps. The execution had to be carefully proportioned. My intention was corrective action and the restoration of balance. Those who had been dismissive were asked to meet the public ledger of consequences. Some apologized openly and some did not. Those who did not found their reputations shifted in slow but irreversible ways. In the end, it was the combination of legal leverage, social truth, and private correctness that recalibrated the story. I never felt pleasure at the fall of a son. My feelings were practical, like a mechanic who must replace a broken bearing. The replacement is not revenge in the primitive sense. It is a necessity. I had fixed bigger problems with less grace and more grit. This one required art. After the dust settled, things did not return to exactly what they had been. Justin learned what it meant to be accountable in small arithmetic ways, not for appearances, but for obligations. He worked through the fallout with his investors and a clarified ledger. He learned to ask for help before the failure arrived. We did not have a Hollywood reconciliation with open arms. Real relationships heal in increments, and days measured in small, predictable acts. At the restaurant, I took inventory of what we had done. The staff returned to work the next morning. The young waiter who had spoken my name at the table took a shift and joked about the oddities of life. The food writer came back once and quietly wrote a follow-up about debt of gratitude. The owner of the venue and I met for coffee once and found ourselves laughing about something small, a shared recollection of the early days when we both thought the city owed us more patience than it did. These were not grand gestures, but evidence of a world readjusting its center of gravity toward truth. What changed in me was not triumph. It was an examination of the way justice and love can be entangled. I had had opportunities to humble him to ruin, and I had chosen not to. There is a difference between teaching and punishing. Punishment risks breeding bitterness and catalytic resentment. Teaching carries the burden of patience and the risk of being ignored. Afterward, Justin came by the bakery attached to one of our restaurants and asked if we could talk. He stood there with the offset smile of someone who had been taught but not in the way he wanted. The conversation was not cinematic. It was quiet, awkward, human. He did not kneel. He did not confess in sweeping statements. He admitted mistakes in small grammatical forms, omissions and neglects, and then asked if there was anything he could do to help. I told him to learn the details of the contracts and to show up for the small people he had dismissed. He did. He came every now and then and helped wash a stack of plates. He learned the smell of the kitchen and the way employees spoke in short, honest bursts. Those who had been slighted noticed his change. Some accepted it, some did not. Memory is a stubborn thing. The machine I had set in motion did not leave the world tidier than I found it, but it rearranged the dynamics enough that the balance of respect returned in increments. I could have chosen a different path. Some evenings I imagine what a less restrained man would have done. I do not pretend my choice was wholly clean or saintly. It was at least proportional and deliberate. Revenge stories sell well because they tap into a primitive satisfaction. They put the world right with a drumbeat of retribution. But if you study carefully, the kind of justice that endures is not the theatrical fury of melodrama. It is the careful application of truth. It is making people face the ordinary machinery that binds societies, contracts, obligations, small decencies, and asking them to either honor it or suffer the consequence in proportion. If there is anything to take from my story, it is this: dignity is not only a private possession, it is a social contract that needs observation. We teach our children not merely with lectures, but by letting them see the cost of neglect. Show them that kindness is not charity but an expectation. Teach them that if they forget, they will be reminded not with cruelty but with truth. Now I will ask you quietly and plainly, what would you have done in my place? There is no single moral bank where answers are deposited. People are different and their judgments vary. Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. Push the like button if this story reminded you that small acts matter. Subscribe for more true, slow-burning narratives of life, liability, and love. Share with someone who needs to read this. That small recalibration might be the lesson they need. I chose to rebuild it with a machine of small forces, with a ledger and friends and quiet resolve. In the end, justice is not a performance. It is a series of well-measured actions, delivered with restraint. That perhaps is the hardest kind of victory to achieve, and the most durable when it comes. What does that look like when the lights are off and the audience has gone home? It looks like opening the shop before sunrise and wiping down a counter no one will compliment. It looks like calling a vendor you disagree with and saying, "We will honor the terms as written, not as remembered." It looks like, showing up in the dish pit beside a 19-year-old who is taking night classes and telling him quietly that the route to dignity is repetition, not applause. It looks like walking past a table where someone once laughed and leaving them to their meal, because restraint is a form of leadership too. I learned that the small architecture of truth is built from habits that outlast emotions. Anger burns hot and bright, and then it asks to be fed again. Habits just continue. I began to keep a second ledger, not the one that tracks inventory and tax, but the one that tracks character. A driver who shows up 5 minutes early 5 days in a row earns a line of credit in that ledger. A manager who admits a mistake without drafting a speech earns another. Even Justin, who now reads a contract line by line and asks questions he once mocked, earns a slow credit that cannot be bought. This is not sentimental accounting. It is the frame that holds institutions together when sentiment fails. When I talk about a machine of small forces, people imagine gears and levers. They are not wrong, but the real gears are people who tell the truth when it hurts a little. A hostess who seats a rude customer without rolling her eyes is a gear. A server who refuses to gossip is a gear. A prep cook who labels every container even on a hectic night is a gear. If you align enough of these gears, you can move something larger than any one person's anger. You can move a culture. There were days when I wanted to settle for the theatrical answer. I could have posted a photo, written a thread, turned my son into an emblem for a story the internet loves to retell. That would have satisfied the crowd for a weekend and damaged something I could not easily repair. I chose the slower path because I wanted a result that would still be true a year from now. A spectacle changes minds for a minute. A standard changes behavior for a lifetime. So I started setting standards again, the way I did when the business was new and fragile. Every Friday, we end the last hour with 3 small questions. What did we fix that no one saw? What did we uphold when it would have been easier not to? Who helped you carry the weight today? The answers are never dramatic. Replace a gasket. Refuse a shortcut. Thank the porter who kept the floor dry. But if you stack those answers week over week, the building stands. The world is messy, but it respects structures that do not sway in every wind. As for Justin, I do not pretend that a single lesson mended every fracture. Families are not equations you solve once. They are systems you tune carefully over time. Sometimes he still chooses appearance over substance, then catches himself and corrects course without prompting. Sometimes he asks me to walk him through a clause, and I make him read it aloud because knowledge that passes through the mouth becomes memory. Sometimes he stays late and scrubs the line with the cooks and no one mentions it, because it is not a photo moment. It is a habit taking root. If you are listening to this because you have been underestimated, or because you have been careless and want a way back, begin with a small force you can control. Show up on time every time for a month. Pay the tiny debt you have ignored. Call the person you slighted, and catch the apology in your throat before it turns into theater. Write down the rule you will not break even when no one is watching. Align enough small forces, and you will move the heavy thing that shame and pride could not. Justice, when it lasts, feels like quiet balance, not triumph. It is the clean click of a door that finally hangs square on its hinges. It is the stove lighting on the first try after a month of sputtering. It is a name on a bill that no longer needs to be spoken out loud. And if you keep at it, if you refuse the easy show in favor of the steady standard, you might wake one morning and discover that the world is still messy, but your corner of it is held together by something solid and calm. What would you have done in my place?